Let's talk about disability justice, a continuation of and reaction to the disability rights movement. So we're going to talk about the 10 principles of the disability justice movement a little bit later, but one of them is leadership of the most impacted. And in order to do that, I want to start by hearing from Lateef McLeod, a poet, novelist, activist, and scholar who has cerebral palsy and has worked with Sins Invalid, one of the organizations that was key in architecting this movement. Here's Lateef.
Disability justice needs to be a part of any plan for liberation because it ensures the inclusion of mostly everyone regardless of ability, gender, race, sexuality, or class. It is an intersectional approach to liberation that tries to not leave anyone out. The practice originated from activists of color with disabilities who saw that the gains of the disability rights movement and the Americans with Disability Act did not address all the concerns that they had being people of color with disabilities, whether it was economic issues or racial issues or issues with the police.
And another key voice, this is Patty Burns. She wrote Disability Justice, a working draft, and has contributed to much disability justice writing before her death. She was also the co-founder and a long-term artistic director of Sins Invalid, a performance and activism organization that was key to this movement. So she talks about this framework as one that understands that all bodies are unique and essential. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We know that we are powerful, not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. We understand that all bodies are caught in these bindings of ability, race, gender, sexuality, class, nation, state, and imperialism, and that we cannot separate them. These are the positions from where we struggle. We are in a global system that is incompatible with life. There is no way to stop a single gear in motion. We must dismantle the machine. So this is a movement that emerged in the 2000s when disability activists of color saw that the disability rights movement had been led by white middle-class disabled people. They desired a more intersectional movement. They designed these 10 principles that we'll discuss. And that reaction, so the disability rights movement, the ADA, did not address all concerns that they had being people of color with disabilities. So what does this mean for a social work context? Let's look at the Code of Ethics, starting with service, which asks us to help people in need and address social problems. So of course, helping people in need, disabled population, but particularly those who are multiply marginalized. And I'll share more about why that matters. And we're addressing social problems like racism, environmental justice, disparities in criminal justice that are inherently linked to and affect disability. Social justice, of course, this is a matter of challenging injustice. We're honoring the dignity and worth of the person by challenging fear and ignorance that keeps others from honoring the dignity and worth of those with disabilities. The fifth principle of this movement is recognizing their wholeness. The movement also includes a principle, the leadership of the most impacted. So we're not only honoring the dignity of individuals, but honoring their worth as leaders. We are honoring our commitment to human relationships, our relationships with our disabled clients of all backgrounds and lived experiences, but this is also a movement based on relationships, with principles like cross-movement solidarity. Integrity, our code of ethics says social workers should take measures to care for themselves professionally and personally. The disability justice principles similarly call for sustainability. Byrne writes that the bodies and environment of people with disabilities need to be preserved. And competence, we have to increase our professional skills beyond just making a space accessible by the standards of the ADA. We have to understand the intersectional factors that compound and complicate a multiply marginalized disabled person's experience. So that brings us to the most impacted. In a 2021 statement for the Harvard Law Review, Belt writes, the disability community is disproportionately Black and brown, female, poor, and LGBTQ. We'll talk about statistics in a moment. But this matters because social inequality that is separate from disability produces and increases disability. So that is part of our social model of disability. It's not the disability that is the problem, it's the lack of access. And then because of that, the lack of accessibility produces and increases social inequality. So let's talk about some examples. Social inequalities like housing inequality, things like lead poisoning, mold, environmental destruction, lead to disability. Other social inequalities like hate crimes, police violence, sexual violence can also increase a person's disability. And then in employment, multiply marginalized people with disabilities experience additional stigma in obtaining employment. So it's social inequalities separate from the disability, but they compound the impact of being disabled on a person's ability to get a job. The reverse, lack of accessibility, produces and increases social inequality. More examples in employment, access to and lack of training for assistive technology kept people with disabilities from performing their work functions during the pandemic. Things like safety measures are not always accessible, like masks for the deaf community. In the legal system, disability can be interpreted as a threat to law enforcement, an inability to comply with commands, which can lead to a person being detained. So that lack of accessibility in a system leads to the social inequality in who is affected by the prison system. Similarly, people with disabilities disproportionately experience socioeconomic disadvantages that increase their risk for contact with the law enforcement and criminal legal system. Some of the root causes, I'll start by quickly talking about the disability rights movement. Pre-1970s, it was a lot about responses to seclusion and institutionalization, things like quote unquote ugly laws that kept people with disabilities who were, in quotes, diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed from being out in public view. And then in the 1970s, there was pushback against education disparities, denial of legally mandated protections in federal and public institutions, which led to the Education for Handicapped Children Act and the implementation of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. In the 1980s, it was about challenging discrimination of people with disabilities in all areas of public life, fighting for full legal citizenship, which led to the 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act. And then the root causes of disability justice. So that foundation had been laid, but then there was this realization that the disability rights movement had a tendency toward erasure, to focus on whiteness, maleness, and heteronormativity. There was an acknowledgement that the ADA failed to address racial, economic, policing, and other disparities. Evidence to support this movement, we could look at many different factors, one being race. The prevalence of disability for working age people 21 to 64, for Native Americans is 15.8%, for Black, 14.1%, white, 11.3%. For people with disabilities living in poverty, Black and African American people live in poverty at 37% with disabilities versus white people 24%, Latinx 29%, Asian American 19%. So there's evidence that social inequality related to race breeds disability, and that disability increases social inequality that already exists. We could look at the legal system. In the general population, 26% of people were disabled in 2018. In prison, 66%. In prison, over half of the Black, Hispanic, and white populations have disabilities. And there's an overrepresentation of Black disabled men and Hispanic disabled men in prison versus the general population. Less than 2% of the general population versus 18 and 12% of the prison population. Disabled individuals make up to a third to a half of all people killed by law enforcement officers, based on an estimation in a 2016 study by Perry and Carter Long. We could look at the LGBTQIA+ community. The unemployment rate in individuals with a disability who identify as LGBTQIA+ are unemployed at 8.8% versus those with a disability who did not identify as LGBTQIA+ at 5.4%. Those living in poverty, LGBTQIA+ adults with disabilities at 46% versus those without disabilities at 20%. Let's look at the lived experience of some folks, and I'm going to bring it back to Lateef McLeod and let you hear from him one more time.
Racism and ableism definitely feed off each other to intensify the oppression for people of color with disabilities. I know as a Black man with cerebral palsy, I encountered a few people that questioned if I had a severe intellectual disability, which is definitely not the case. Anyone who has a chance to have a conversation with me can figure that out. But the compounded oppressive experience on ableism and racism has a profound effect on people as intellectuals like
So how did this enhance my perspective? I have never had to consider that there's an assumption made that if a person of color has a disability, it is an intellectual disability based on racism, based on stigma, based on underestimation. And so we have to think about not only what are people with disabilities in general already dealing with, but then how is that compounded by any other identity that they might hold? And in the Padlet, I'm going to link to some of Latif's performances so you can get more of a sense of his work. I'm also going to link to some of the amazing theater and dance performances by Sins Invalid. I mentioned it before, it's a disability justice-based performance project that incubates and celebrates artists with disabilities, centralizing artists of color and LGBTQ gender variant artists as communities who have been historically marginalized. I love this quote from co-founder and long-term artistic director Patty Byrne, that Crip life invites us into fierce creativity. Because the world continues to treat us as worthless, creating new worlds is a matter of survival for us. And I love this because it made me think about what I was taught about Shakespeare. I'll keep this brief. But when I was learning about Shakespeare, I was taught that it is a form with a lot of parameters and rules and structure. And because of that, you get to be creative. You have a lot that's given to you. And so you get to be creative in what you bring to it and how you play with it. The structure breeds creativity. And Patty Burns sees disability in the same way. It's not a limitation, it's a set of parameters, a set of structures that allows for creativity and in many ways requires it. So how can we respond at the micro, meso, and macro level? I'll combine this with the role of social workers, and I'll use the 10 principles of disability justice to offer some solutions. So at the micro level, we can start with sustainability. We could teach self-care and practice it ourselves. Interdependence is challenging what is called the myth of independence, that every person should be independent in order to be successful. We can allow for, celebrate, and encourage interdependence by facilitating mutual aid work through group work. We can recognize wholeness. I love this quote. Stop valuing some types of labor, like being in the streets, or contributions, like writing academic articles, over others. We can value all types of labor in activism, in organizing, in making change within this movement. At the meso level, we can honor the leadership of the most impacted. This means employing and promoting disabled people of color, particularly those with darker skin, queer people, trans, people in larger bodies, older disabled people, low-income disabled people. And this might mean removing some of the barriers of access to leadership positions and promotions, might mean inviting people into organizing spaces and supporting their leadership. We can honor a commitment to cross-movement organizing. So this is about shifting how social justice movements understand disability and contextualize ableism. For us, maybe we create access and opportunities for interdependence in organizing spaces. We can offer program analysis and engage in research to understand the intersections of disability and other social justice issues. We can commit to cross-disability solidarity, honoring the insights and participation of all community members. So we can advocate for spaces that accommodate different types of disabilities and create social work groups that facilitate cross-disability collaboration and communication. We can create collective access. Byrne talks about this as we can share responsibility for our access needs without shame. We can ask for our needs to be met without compromising our integrity. We can balance autonomy while being in community. So as social workers, we need to stop assuming that the ADA just automatically covers individual and group access needs. We can be proactive and curious in asking about access needs and joyful and creative in designing solutions. At the macro level, we can work to ensure intersectionality. We can use Crenshaw's theory that interventions for people with different lived experiences must be different. We need to consider intersectionality in designing disability policy and overseeing its implementation. Anti-capitalist politics is a key principle. Byrne talks about how the construction of disability is derived from the exploitation of the body. And so for us, that means designing policy that doesn't rely on capitalist notions of productivity, and also valuing what Byrne calls crip labor, centering the work and voices of disabled people, particularly people of color, to inform policymaking. And lastly, collective liberation. This is about no body or mind left behind, moving together to accomplish revolution. And so we can engage in stakeholder outreach and lobbying to ensure that collective liberation. My call to action is for you to find one opportunity in your work, field placement, or community you're a part of to go beyond access and toward justice and interdependence. This is Mingus writes about a model of disability that embraces difference, confronts privilege, and challenges what is considered normal. So an example of that would be in my field placement next year, I'll be contributing to a free virtual body image support group. Traditional notions of access would say it's virtual, that helps with physical accessibility. We'll turn on closed captions, that helps with visually impaired or hearing impaired folks. But justice and interdependence tells us to go deeper. We can think about the time of the meeting. Right now, it's on Mondays at noon. Maybe that accommodates lunchtime for some people, but for a lot of folks with especially entry-level jobs, not a lot of work flexibility, that's not going to be accessible to them. If someone has Wi-Fi issues or doesn't have access to a device, this is not going to be accessible. We have to think about the accessibility of the requirements to enter a space. For this space, you have to be in Massachusetts and you have to be seeing another licensed provider. Are we providing access to make sure people can have those other providers? Are we providing referrals? What documentation are we requiring to make sure they live in Massachusetts? The facilitators are two queer white women. How can we invite in other guest facilitators, co-facilitators from other communities so that disabled people of multiple experiences see themselves reflected and feel welcome? How are we promoting these groups in spaces and in ways that makes people feel reflected, welcome, seen? All right, some resources and organizations addressing the issue. Showing Up for Racial Justice has a disability and access toolkit. It's practices and access considerations for us to build capacity to engage disability activists with relevancy and respect. So Sins Invalid, I've talked about a couple times now, but they have specific resources on their website like language justice and disability justice, climate justice, reproductive justice, and access suggestions. And lastly, the Center for Racial and Disability Justice, which develops legal and policy tools to make courts and other public systems more accessible, research policy analysis and tools to enhance accountability and equitable care systems, and research and tools directed at economic justice for people with disabilities. And you can find all those links in the Padlet description, as well as this question, which I hope that you might consider answering. What is one accessible space in your personal, professional, or community life that meets logistical accessibility requirements, but is not actually accessible to members of one or more multiply marginalized groups? So, in other words, what is a space in your life that is accessible by disability rights standards, but not accessible by disability justice standards? I will leave that in the Padlet as well as my resource list. Thank you so much for watching.